Good that they put
Okay,
those right together.
so we're back, and this week we're talking about beer and our favorite beer styles. So, Adrian, I know you mentioned to me at one point that you were a home brewer, and I've done that as well. And what got you into it, and what maybe got you out of it?
Well, so I had a good friend who brewed beer, and he was really the beer master. He's the one who got me into it. He had been brewing for years when I met him. And, it was passed down to him from friends of his that he met. And it was just something that we did that was a lot of fun. Even after we started having kids, we would get together, brew beer together, try different recipes, try out different things, and enjoy it together. So it was a reason to get together, and it was a really cool tradition and hobby. And honestly, it became too much work, takes up too much space. Like a lot of work goes into just getting everything clean.
Yep.
Like the amount of like everything had to be bleached. Just going through the carboys, going through the buckets, and I still have all the equipment hanging around. And it's probably been over a decade since I've used it. But I've made wine and other things as well too.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I started, I want to say about 97. A friend and I, after we graduated from college, just happened to come across a home brew store, and we were like, you can do this?
Yeah.
And like, sure, why not? And, so we had an apartment, and, you're putting everything in a closet, the coat closet by the door, because that's the darkest, coolest place we could find for it to kind of sit there and ferment. And, but yeah, so I kept going in and out of it. It's one of those hobbies where I'm like, I stop it, and then I'm gonna get back into it. I think about maybe 7 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago, I built a 4-tap keezer to hold all my beer because I got tired of bottling everything. But now I'm kind of at the point where beer just doesn't do a whole lot for me as much as, say, a whiskey or something. And so I may end up having to convert that into something else. So, but yeah, it was a fun hobby. I tell people it's like brewing tea. You've got a recipe you follow, and you sit there, you let it brew, and then you let it simmer, and you add some more ingredients, you let it ferment and bottle, let it ferment some more, and you're good to go. So Mark, you just went to a beer festival.
Yes, I did. It was the Vermont Brewers Association Beer Festival. It's designed to feature beers from the different Vermont brewers that are part of the association, but they do have beers. This year they actually had one from all the way down in North Carolina come up, and then they also had they always have like folks from Quebec, some of the microbrewers up there also come down, and then some from upstate New York and some from New Hampshire as well. So even though it's the Vermont Brewers Association, I guess they have some invited guests or whatever. So it's really neat. They have it down in Burlington, Vermont, down at the Waterfront Park on Lake Champlain. They have a bunch of food trucks set up as well with local foods, and Vermont Smoke and Cure was out there passing out free samples of their jerky sticks. They had a big water truck this year too, because it was very hot. So they had a water truck there for anybody to just either rinse your glass off, which was also cool, but also in case you needed to rehydrate a bit too.
Yeah.
They give you a small glass with the logo on it and everything in the year. So we have actually a collection of them because this was like the 5th year we've gone. And you just get a wide variety of stuff. We've learned long since to avoid the lines for like the Alchemist and Lawson's Finest Liquids. Not that they're not great beers, but everybody knows those names now.
Right.
So everybody's waiting in line for their beers, which we're like, well, we can get Lawson Sip of Sunshine at the grocery store anytime we want. Why are we going to wait in line for that? So.
Yeah. In the meantime, you can try 4 or 5 ones you
Yeah,
haven't heard
exactly.
of, right?
So there was one from, I think it was Rutland Beer Works, had a really great new ale that they had out. A couple had a blueberry wheats, so it's like a Hefeweizen with like a blueberry tone to it. that were kind of tasty and refreshing for that particular day. There was it's a Brasserie du Ciel or something like that from Montreal, that had or the Montreal area that had it was a really strong, it wasn't like a barley wine, but it was like a really strong porter or stout. The ABV was very up there, but it was really, really tasty as well. Anybody that follows me on Untapped can kind of go back through the plethora of beers that I checked into that day. So it was very good. Good way to sample a wide variety of things in a short period of time. Just a little taste of each, but it's enough to give you an idea of what they're all about.
So was it like an
festival
entry? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a similar. I was just gonna say we have a similar festival here, and a collection of those same like miniature glasses. They kind of this shape, but smaller with the logo on it, and it's always fun to go to.
Yeah. So to the question of whether there's an entrance fee, yeah, it's like they have. I want to say it was like 4 or 5 sessions. There's like a Friday afternoon, Friday evening, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Each session's about 4 hours long. You have to buy tickets in advance, and it's sort of like almost like actually like an information security conference where like you can get in and then get your name in a hat for like pre-ticket sales, and then they have the regular ticket sales a bit later for whoever's still missing tickets or who doesn't get lucky the first time around. So far we've gotten lucky each time, and more and more they're favoring, like there's one session, it's like the Friday session, which we prefer not to go to actually because Friday is still a work day. But if you're a local, like if you have a Vermont zip code, you get favoritism in terms of getting tickets for that session. But yeah, it's like $40 gets you the glass you get to keep, and you get like 15 tickets, which each count for one beer. If it's under 8%, if it's 8% or higher, you have to pay 2 tickets instead. Gotcha. And then you have an ATM on site. You can pull some cash and buy some additional tickets.
Okay.
If you want. So
cool.
Yeah. So we usually do that. We usually also end up getting one batch of extra tickets to get just a couple more in. But then I use some of my hotel points to get a hotel room for the night in Burlington that we can just stumble over to instead of attempting to drive anywhere. And being that it's a Vermont, getting a Lyft or Uber back to the house is like not really an option. So
you get a bit of a workout too, because going anywhere is uphill from the lakeside, right?
Yep, that's true. Yeah. So
how far is Burlington from where you live?
About 40 minutes.
Oh, okay. So not too far.
Yeah, not too bad. So
cool. So while we're still talking about beer, then there's 2 different main styles of beer. Most of us in America are very familiar with the Pilsner style. For whatever reason, that seems to have dominated. I think there's a story about the Bush family and air conditioners and all sorts of stuff in this country versus the old European countries where ales tend to be dominant. And I was reading an article last week about the Pilsner yeast, because that's really what makes the difference is the yeast strain that's being done in those 2 breweries or 2 brew styles, is that it was a mutation of the old ale yeast. And Adrian, you may know this as well, is that ales tend to be fermented in a warm environment, whereas Pilsners are fermented in a chilled environment, which is why most homebrewers do an ale style, because you don't have to have these big refrigeration systems to ferment the beer. And so that
it's funny you mention that, because it's been so long. Like I remember there being reasons we didn't make certain types of beer, because it was too complicated. It took extra equipment we didn't have, or like there were reasons, but I don't remember any of those reasons now.
Yeah.
Like, I just remember everything we made were just certain types, like, usually an ale style, or, we made a lot of porters and stouts.
Yeah. So those are all ales, just based on the yeast strain. So my understanding, if I get this correct, is that the Pilsner yeast is actually a bottom fermenting yeast when it's being chilled, whereas the ale styles, when it's warmer, sit at the top. And that's what the main difference is between the two styles. Because again, beer is really just water, hops, yeast, and some kind of grain.
Right.
So
Which
it's not a very
traditionally
complicated
it's typically barley.
Correct.
If you're going to be a purist about it. And I think that's actually what the German law of purity, the Reinheitsgebot, which the Bavarians will claim is theirs, rightfully so, from 1517, says that it has to be barley specifically, although there's an exception for Weizens, Hefeweizens, because that's obviously wheat.
The wheat beer.
Yeah. But the idea was back then that you had people trying to brew beer with like lentils and peas and all kinds of other crap, and well, not unlike today, actually, from some brewers. And so they basically made it a law that it could only have those 5 ingredients. And I think that's one of the reasons why, like, the mass produced, like the Miller Coors, AB InBev, like Budweiser stuff. Part of the reason why I think I dislike it so much is the lack of flavor, because they use rice as their adjunct grain instead of like barley, because it's much cheaper.
Yep.
I had no idea.
That's also what makes Japanese beers very, let's say, subdued versus like an IPA or a bitter ale or things like that. So,
yep.
I did not know that rice and corn is still used today to make some beers.
Yeah, like Yingling Lager from the Yingling Brewery in Pennsylvania, which is America's oldest continually operating brewery since the 1800s. They sort of squeaked by through prohibition by brewing like really low alcohol beers, that they were able to get away with that. And their lager today,
light beer is what you're saying.
What's that?
They invented the light beer.
Yeah, basically. So their lager, for example, brews with it's exactly the Reinheitsgebot, but they use corn instead of barley or something like that, because it's a lot less expensive. And in that area of Pennsylvania, there's lots of cornfields. So
right.
Although it's interesting, I had a friend who's like not so corn tolerant, and Yingling caused some, we'll just call it dietary problems for them if they drank any quantity of it. So,
wow,
I believe it.
So it's interesting. I wonder what the process was that led them to say, I mean, I think water, hops, yeast are pretty obvious. You need the yeast to make the alcohol. The hops have a very distinctive flavor. But I wonder why they settled on barley particularly. I wonder if that was like some kind of political or financial reason, or just totally taste.
That's a good question. I would imagine it's probably a bit of both. I think any kind of legislative type thing like that, I have to think that there's some kind of government thing or government kickback, or, the king said so because he happened to have lots of barley fields.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Or barley was the cheapest thing they had at the time.
It could be that, yeah, back then barley was actually the cheaper grain. I mean, because you think about it, so much of what we have today fundamentally relies on barley, scotches and whiskeys and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the primary components of most, well, certainly Scotch is pretty much all barley. And then even for like American bourbons, which of course need at least 50% corn, you're still going to have other like rye and wheat and barley and stuff as well. So,
yeah. So Adrian, what's your favorite style today? What is it that if you were to go, hey, that's really what's going to hit the spot?
So I'll go through a bit of history. When I first met the woman who became my wife, I told her I didn't like beer, and she told me I just hadn't had the right kind yet. And she was right. And it was actually her friend. She was the one that introduced me to the guy that brewed beer. And of course, he, finding out that I didn't drink beer, he took the opportunity to introduce me to just about everything. And I found my first love were porters and stouts. I really liked dark beers. And I came to love like Sam Smith oatmeal porters in general. Oatmeal porters I really like. And then I discovered imperial porters, and I'm still a huge fan of imperial porters, though. I've recently gotten into sours and all sorts of other beers. I like IPAs. I'm not too stingy about I think Hefeweizens are really the only ones that I'm not crazy about. But still, imperial stouts have, a special place in my heart. And especially like the dragon milk stout, which I actually have a bottle of here. And I'm trying to think of the name. You guys will know what I'm talking about. Rasputin Imperial Stout is another good one. Yeah, so that's New Holland makes that guy. And
Oh yes, I've had that.
I used to get the big bottle versions of it. I actually didn't realize that they had smaller ones. And this has been a more recent thing, I think, for alcohol in general, is kind of mixing and matching what you age stuff in. So this is a bourbon barrel aged stout. And that's also one of my favorite beers. Bear with me a second. Rustle around off camera. Big fan of these. These guys always come out with.
Oh yes. Their barrel aged stuff, like the different types that they use.
It's very good.
Very, very good. I really like
change
them.
it up every year a little bit, and just you can't go wrong with these. These are always good.
You can almost drink that in public and pass it off as a root beer too.
Yeah. And then this is pretty popular down here. I think it's probably one of the most disappointing labels I've seen, but it's one of my favorites. This is actually a coffee stout, but just the regular Kentucky bourbon barrel ale you can get on tap most places here in East Tennessee, and it's one of my favorites.
Awesome. What about you, Mark?
So I don't have a variety to show other than it's a typical Vermont. This is Lost Nations Lost Galaxy IPA. Vermont is probably right up there with the West Coast IPAs of like San Diego and the Russian River Valley and stuff in terms of that genre, the India Pale Ale. Which was always, of course, excessively hopped so that the beer would better survive the sea journeys from India back to England or vice versa as they were going back and forth. And so it tends to be a bit hoppier. I like a lot of the Vermont brewers for this particular style more than most because IPAs can be a very finicky thing to balance. You can either have ones that are just very malty and sweet, and there's actually not a whole lot of like hoppiness to them. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but on the other hand, you have a lot of people that make IPAs that think it has to be a super resiny pine cone, bitter pill to swallow kind of thing, and I dislike those as well. Most Vermont brewers tend to get a really good balance. That's what makes like the Alchemist Heady Topper like such a great beer. It's just nuanced to no end. But so IPAs in general are one of the big ones, especially the New England IPAs. They tend to be a lot hazier, juicier, the so-called dank IPAs. But I like a wide variety. I started off probably, if I was to do a historical journey, kind of like Adrian did, is Hefeweizens, because it came from being an exchange student in Germany and spending time there. So of course that was a big new genre. Like, oh, there's more to life than just crappy American Pilsner styles like Budweiser and stuff. So I still like those. I wouldn't drink those like a Hefeweizen like excessively. Like it's kind of like a one and done kind of thing for me now, because you're literally drinking like liquid banana bread. Um, I love porters, stouts. About the only genre I really couldn't get into personally was the sours. I did a run of sours like we did to get the Untapped badge for it or whatever, and it was really, really hard to get through that to get the badge. Of interest, or an interesting note, though, there is a Vermont brewery called Hermit Thrush. I think they're down in Brattleboro, and they actually specialize in sours, but specifically they have a SIPA, which is a sour IPA. It's a really interesting take on sours that still has like some of the hoppiness of an IPA, and they actually do a really good job at bringing out the best of both of those genres.
Interesting.
And I've never found that from any other brewer than these guys.
We actually have if you ever find yourself down this way, we've got a great brewery called Crafty Bastard. And they're the ones that got me into sours, really. And if you know Travis Goodspeed, on any given afternoon, that's where you'll find him drinking. And they've got an Earl Grey Pale Ale that's really good also. But they've got some fairly mainstream stuff, and then they get just really creative with their other stuff, and most of it's worth a try at the very least. But yeah, they had a cherry sour that, like I was ordering it and I was like, yeah, I don't know, and by the end of it, I was like, okay, I'll take another.
I guess we forgot to add Belgian lambics to the show note as well. Forgot to bring that out as an interesting point. Those are the Belgians that are the very like blueberry and other fruity kind of flavors. To me, they're way too sweet. It's like I don't dislike them, but at the same time, I wouldn't go out of my way to drink them just because it's not quite the genre I'm interested in. So
Interesting.
What about you, Jeremy?
So, like both of you have done a journey of beers. I was never really a big beer drinker. I spent my last semester in college in England, however, which again, you go to Europe, it opens up. Oh, there's porters, there's stouts, there's all other, brown ales, whatever. Every pub has got their own house ale, etc. And then when I got into home brewing, it was like, oh, I'll do these IPAs. You couldn't buy them at that point, right? In the late 90s, early 2000s, there's nobody selling an IPA. And so I was doing IPAs at that time frame. Sorry, I was kind of ahead of the curve. And I'll drink an IPA, but it's not that's my go-to beer. And so again, I lean towards the heavier stuff. And it's funny that you brought out, milk stout. So I've got Left Hand's milk stout.
That's good stuff.
And I picked this one just because the distribution's pretty wide. So I figured everybody had heard of Left Hand. I think they're out of Colorado, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, they are. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things about milk stouts is that the sugar in milk is not eaten by the yeast during the fermentation process. And so that's why milk stouts tend to be a little sweet, is that residual sugar still holds on through the entire brewing process and is part of the flavor. Whereas when you're brewing other sugars, the yeast eat all that sugar as they're creating the alcohol content. So I like it because to me, they're very easy to drink. And especially with just that slight bit of sweetness. I like almost all stouts, all porters. I'm not a coffee drinker, so I stay away from any of those things. Those drive me nuts. So, but I mean, I'll be honest. I've sat on a catamaran in the Caribbean and drank El Presidente, and it's the greatest thing ever. But that's a crap beer. But when the environment calls for it,
yeah,
good.
it's
Yes.
the context.
Yes.
There
when
is
you're
a
in
time and a
Mexican
place for a
restaurant-
Corona with lime.
Yeah, when you're in a Mexican restaurant, a giant mug of Dos Equis, is just fine.
Yeah, and like I said, for like those Japanese beers, their lack of like really strong flavors is actually very complementary to things like sushi, which is, you need the delicacy of the, your palate to be able to pick out the nuances of the sushi.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want like a really strong like IPA like destroying all your taste buds before you eat the fish. So
Yeah,
that's true.
there's,
So, Mark, you had some news you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, it was kind of in line with the styles. There's all the traditional, the variations of lagers, the ales, of which obviously IPA is part of that same ale genre, of, English pale ales and all the rest. So it's interesting that there was some news. The article I put in the show notes is from NPR, but I think a few different agencies covered it, which is basically that they're experimenting with some really ancient strains of yeast and recipes for ales. And, the article touched upon some specifics, but we've seen this in general. Like Dogfish Head has been doing a variety of experimentation beers with, trying to recreate an ancient Egyptian recipe. And it's interesting that we're seeing that more and more, just a wide variety of experimentation again into some rather more unusual styles of beer and trying to resurrect ancient styles that used to exist, presumably a long time ago.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome.
Yeah, so wasn't in Egyptian times, wasn't it more like mead that they were drinking? Weren't they making stuff out of honey?
Yes and no. They have both some mead styles, and then also some of their first beers actually were from that era. And it's arguable whether you would call what they brewed beer, but you wouldn't really call it mead either. There's a gentleman by the name of Tom Standage who actually wrote a great book called A History of the World in Six Glasses. And he basically associates various leaps in human evolution and the development of humanity and civilization based on some new alcohol. Generally. So there's the booze of, the initial, we wouldn't be here at all as a species if we didn't have beer, because the water would have killed everybody by then. But then there was like getting into like the fermentation of wine in Mesopotamia and into like Greece and the Romans. Talked a bit about like what kind of wine like Socrates would have drank at one of his dinner parties. And then he goes into, whiskey for the American Revolution, the Enlightenment in general preceding that, actually based off of the non-alcoholic coffee and coffee shops. It was just, of course, he ends with Coca-Cola, which is a bit of a letdown, I suppose, but it was a really interesting book. It's Around the World in Six Glasses. I think it's Tom Standage. But that initial history about the discussion about those early beers, and wine too, and how different that was from what we now know as beer and wine today.
Right.
Because you have to think, like, those folks, when they were first making these things, just as they had no idea why exactly bread happened to work the way it did, they didn't really know, like, because you couldn't see yeast. There wasn't, before we had microscopes, we didn't know that there were these tiny little things like eating sugar and how all that worked. They just, got lucky.
It was the special stirring stick, right? Didn't they
Right.
have like like a
You
special
lick
stick
it six
that
times and then stir it, and
and that's how they were using the same strain of yeast over and over again, as it was in the wood of the stick that they were using to stir the vat, and they just became lucky or something like that.
Yeah, so really interesting.
So it's interesting. I looked that up, and I'm sure we'll put that in the show notes. But the Kindle book is $9.07 for A History of the World in 6 glasses, or you can pay 88 cents more and get the study guide, or
guide.
You can pay 92 cents more and get the summary of it. So apparently somebody's using this for. There's a Chinese edition too. Wow. So
there's a class for it somewhere that there's an exam.
For there to be demand for the equivalence of Cliff Notes.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll check that out.
A little bit of history.
I think that's about all I had for beer news.
Today I learned that yeast is lactose intolerant. And
yes.
Yes, I guess that's true.
That's a great way of looking at it. I had not thought of it that way.
Well, why else wouldn't it look at it?
Yeah.
Why else wouldn't it eat it?
I don't know. It's pretty cool. Well, thanks everybody, and subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next week.